So hi, everybody. I'm Adriana Bankston. I'm currently a principal legislative analyst at the University of California Federal Government Relations. And I'm also the CEO for the journal Science Policy and Governance. And today we'll be talking about the science to policy interface and how you can engage in policy and advocacy as an early career scientist, the kind of impact you can make in the field, and what it means to create good policy, who the players are, and how early career scientists can engage in the system itself. I'll be telling you a little bit about my personal journey as well, and the journal in terms of professional development opportunities for the next generation in science policy. Okay, so we'll get started with the presentation now. Let me share the slides. Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today about the science to policy interface and how to impact society through science policy. So before I start, I just have to tell you that this is my personal view and not the views of my employer. So I want to start really basic about the definition of science policy and what we mean when we say science policy. So according to the book Beyond Sputnik, which is one of the classic books, national science policy is defined as the set of federal rules, regulations, and methods and practices and guidelines under which scientific research is conducted. And one thing I want to impart is that science and policy are interconnected, as you can see by the double arrow, and they influence each other in what we think of as a science to policy interface. And there are two fundamental concepts in policy: science for policy and policy for science. Depending on which issues you work on, you may be either on one side of the spectrum or the other, or you may switch between the two. Many times when we think about scientists influencing policy, you think about science for policy. And the other way around also is true, in that if you think about policies that affect the practice of science, things related to institutional change, improving the university system, and systemic change in academia, that sort of thing, would be policy for science. Whereas science for policy is what you would typically think of scientific findings and evidence used as the basis for public policy. So today we'll be talking more about science for policy and what it means to do evidence-based decision-making. So federally funded research is critical, of course, for impacting innovation, economic growth, and social well-being, thinking through how to connect with policymakers and the public who are a big part of this ecosystem, as we'll discuss later. Policymakers don't always know how to really exploit the most important opportunities that exist. And so having analytical capacity in science policy typically has been lacking, according to this book, The Science of Science Policy. Compared to other fields, there is a lack of analytical capacity in the field. And this has sought to be improved upon through developing a community of practice and really studying science policy as a field in itself. So this community of practice is emerging to advance the scientific basis of science policy and what it really means to be evidence-based, for example, through grant programs like the NSF SciSip and others, international ones as well. And so if we think about the connection between science and policy and what it means to look at the science of science policy, some recent aims that have emerged involve developing evidentiary basis for decision-making by policy practitioners, developing the community between policymakers and researchers, creating connections between origins and later trajectories of social systems that will provide guidance to policymakers, as well as the economics of policy. And what does that mean? To really craft good policymaking that will really impact society, and also how these investments contribute to innovation ultimately. In the recent landscape, and this is a very useful book for background, using scientific approaches for consensus that we'll talk about is useful for informing and providing knowledge to policymakers, and also influencing decisions by which policy choices are made. And that also relates to sequences that stream downstream from decision-making policies that are acted upon, or in advocacy, for example, specific legislation, and what will be the downstream impacts of that. So what do we mean when we talk about the science to policy interface? I know you've heard about this before, but the ways in which science has been engaged to support government decision-making has evolved over the last 80 years. And this involves translating different languages of scientists and policymakers, as well as aligning information needs with outputs between the two communities. And so, for example, advice from scientists can inform decisions made by policymakers. So this is, again, science for policy. And formulating how these views are done takes into account a number of factors, again, because policy is very dependent on science and vice versa. So a little bit of history. Before World War II, science was rarely in effective contact with policymaking, as well as the political processes. So this really has evolved over time. At the time, policymaking was understood to be in the pursuit of common good, and essentially in the best interest of the public that the government serves. So there's a lot of public engagement here early on that was and continues to be a big part of this ecosystem. And the connection and the pursuit of common good may occur through several mechanisms, such as science advice to governments or communicating to the public. And while policymaking may be based on scientific evidence, it's actually not always clear how this knowledge enters the policymaking process and what mechanisms and structures exist for influencing policymaking. So as you will see, policymaking is a dynamic process, takes into account many types of inputs. And still, however, the most effective means of connecting science with policy is debatable. And there's a recent analysis from the UN looking at essentially the gap between these two concepts. And this analysis looks at a program so they developed a program out of this analysis, looking at capacity building to provide policy support tools. So again, the resources that I share here, the UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Center, did essentially a case study about how to develop this interface. That's a useful read. And so strengthening the interface between science and policy can be done by a certain framework that looks at the gap analysis, capacity building, as well as the tools that are needed to support this transition. So in the concept, now getting a little bit more practical, the science to policy interface can be parsed into several categories of conduct. Another book to point out here, The Honest Broker, which you've probably heard about, Roger Pilkey describes 4 categories or roles of scientists and the interaction that they have with the policy community. Most interest has traditionally focused on the distinction between the issue advocate and the honest broker or policy alternatives. So the issue advocate provides evidence synthesis with a specific agenda or programmatic outcome. This is what you'd consider real advocacy. In contrast, the honest broker is really an unbiased view of the evidence that exists, but they don't take a position on it. So they assist policymakers in making choices between different options. They provide input and ideas and the background on that, but don't try to influence the decision. The science arbiter has a narrow focus, so they somewhat do the same thing, but they focus on specific questions. They again don't want to influence the direction of the policy. Finally, pure scientists don't always engage with the policy community. So really 4 different quadrants here, which you can see. They also differ based on the views of science and society and the views of democracy. Again, you can read more about this in the book, but it's important to make the distinction between an advocate and someone who provides background information, data, and isn't really engaged in policy, or is engaged but really doesn't try to influence policy. And all of these are valid ways to be at this interface. So this begs the question then, how science contributes to the policymaking process and how the process actually works. So there's a lot of history here. Again, this has been around for about 80 years. But the goal of good policy should really be improving the overall welfare of society. And as we'll see, science policy is the product of multiple inputs, mechanisms, and interactions. It's very complex. It involves many different entities, for example, executive agencies, congressional committees, can occur through multiple mechanisms, such as legislation, as other ways, as I'll show you today. Implementation of the policy once created can also occur through multiple mechanisms, a number of different levels. Probably the most common is through a budget, to where you're looking to increase the funding to a specific program, but there are different ways to do that. And also, once the policy has been implemented, interpreting the policy and the result, again, can differ based on who it is, what the players are, and can really impact society depending on how the interpretation happens as well. So the process of policymaking is complex. So here's a quote by John Kingdon. The processes by which public policies are formed are exceedingly complex. You can have an agenda, develop alternatives and choices among those alternatives, which really are governed by different forces. All of them are complicated, as well as the relationship is between them, and they're very dynamic, fluid, and loosely joined. So this is very accurate. So I'll do my best to explain sort of how things are done, but just sort of keep in mind that it's very case-by-case basis, and thinking through sort of a case study of how the process happens. It's very dynamic, as we'll get into some of this. So again, we should think about policy as something that can influence society positively, and the goal is to contribute to the overall welfare of society. So this is the web here. I'll go into this in a second. Policymaking involves consensus building and works by collective decision making, recognizing what a communal action can make society better off. So a lot of times, a lot of these players work together to push something on Capitol Hill, or really advocate for a specific issue. Consensus building is really central to this, which essentially means that a number of stakeholders get together, discuss a specific issue, and will come down to a collective understanding of what they want to put forward. And in that, you can imagine that all these players, it's hard to agree sometimes on specific positions on specific issues. But it's really important, especially when you're talking about legislation and putting something forth as a community, what this is going to look like, and consensus is important for that. However, consensus has to be made with limited resources, sometimes quickly, turn around, you have to respond to something that's happening in policy. You have imperfect information, maybe incomplete information, and you have to make the best decision and move forward. In addition, science policy is also pluralistic, as we can see, again, a number of players. And it is supported by a number of agencies. So again, this is sort of the US model. multiple agencies that fund research, federal funded research at different topics. The agencies themselves are overseen by multiple congressional committees, which are in this web. At the center, you can see key White House offices, such as OSCP and OMB, as well as federal agencies, congressional committees and subcommittees, and also scientific societies, which are represent a number of scientific interests, more specific ones, as well as university associations and non-government organizations like the national academies. And again, these are all interconnected and communicate with each other. The press also then connects these groups to certain peripheral groups. And these groups can be universities or industry, national labs, scientific societies, state and local governments, and the general public, all of which have specific interests in policy. And again, they'll try to influence policy in a specific way, either biased, pushing a specific advocacy position, or providing evidence, as I showed you in the example of the other roles in the field. So the groups at the center are continuously influenced by interactions with those in the outer thread, which again, you can see the public is on the outside. Then you'll have societies, industries, national labs, again, connect with the public, connect with Congress, for example. And then again, agencies, you can see the media sort of all throughout this, right? Which constantly talks to one player or the other. So very complex, and thinking through, again, the specific policy will have involve a number of these players. So how does this actually happen? Again, this is kind of the US version of how things are done. So there are three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. Legislative is where the laws are made. Congress is here. They will then be carried out in the executive branch, where the president is and signs the laws. And judicial is where the laws are evaluated, the Supreme Court. Then they'll go back to the executive and eventually go to the president. Again, there are various stakeholders, which I showed you in the web. Thinking through this again, what the different areas are and what they can do, right? So the president can sort of do all things, can issue executive directives, appointments, can determine the budget, which happens every spring, has authorities to sign bills or not, or agree or not agree to do that. Communicate, of course, with other countries, coordinate agencies, and so on. The executive branch offices are sort of the next level. They're related to the president, but do sort of their own thing and communicate. Agencies, again, can interpret laws, can influence the budget, and a lot of times, again, the legislation itself includes what agencies can do, or it'll say a specific budget for a particular agency. Congress has a certain level of power in terms of legislation, can again pass the budget, and judiciary again is where the laws are interpreted. So really there is a lot of crosstalk between these groups, and sometimes back and forth to making sure that legislation, for example, will be signed into a law. So now going into how policymaking is actually made. Again, there's, like, as I said, it's complicated. There's a lot of players, as you can see. So how can you sort of begin to think about this as in a specific way? So what does it mean to do good policy, and how do you do that? So again, another book, Introduction to Public Policy. And this is something you can do sort of on your own, thinking through an issue that you want to solve. At a high level, when we're thinking about policymaking, kind of making a distinction between policy design and analysis. But also if you have an idea or something you want to change, that can really be implemented through some of the mechanisms that I've described up to now. So when you think about policy analysis, so one is sort of what policy already exists. How do I analyze that? How do I change that versus creating something new? So policy analysis refers to identifying some policy options that could address the problem and then comparing them to each other, which is sort of the second half of this. But if you want to start from scratch and really address a specific goal, you want to think about identifying a social goal, problem that you want to solve in society, and think about what is the societal benefit that can be achieved through effective public action. So what is an issue? How can society benefit from that? What is the problem? So that you're getting more specific. What behavior has to change in order to achieve that stated goal? So is it something that your federal government can do? Is it a state government? Is it your university? Now getting down even deeper, identifying the appropriate institution for action. So you have the issue, who can act on that issue? Who's the authority that can actually change the behavior in a way that will bring about the desired outcome? So, right, that's very abstract. But thinking about this through, again, is it at the university level? Is it at the state level? Is a specific person, for example, is it the director of a funding agency that you wanna direct this to and get them to do something? Once you have an idea of who it is and what you might want them to do, you then evaluate the substance and politics of the competing policy options. So you want to come up with policy options in ways that the problem might be solved. Some ideas, you can write down a number of ideas. Something that is feasible, that is not too expensive, that you think is feasible in a specific time frame, is also politically acceptable. So there are sort of norms within the system that need to be addressed as well. And then once you come down to a specific policy idea or position, how do you then implement it, enforce it, and monitor the policy change? How is it going to be funded, right? How will it be enforced? For example, is it something, again, at the university level that can happen? How will it be monitored or modified if necessary? Who is going to benefit from this? But also how it will be really implemented practically, right? So sometimes when you're going for example, designing a new program, that will mean, a new staff person has to be hired. How much will that cost? That sort of thing. So the practical things related to the policy. So in order to really be effective in policymaking, here are some questions to ask yourself. And again, you can sort of go through this exercise on a specific question. So you want to think about the ideas that the policy that you're building needs to be practical, also in the context of what's happening politically, right? So knowing what's happening around you, what the legislators are talking about, what they're looking to implement. So you don't want to just do policy in a vacuum, really want to be relevant to what's happening. And also what the practical aspects are going to be, right? What I already said, how the policy will be monitored and implemented and so on. So in terms of really very high level questions, what is the existing landscape? For example, if you're thinking about climate change, who's working on this? What kind of legislation is out there? What positions are people taking or universities taking, for example, doing it on behalf of your university? What need does the policy fill? And what will you accomplish? So if it's a legislation that doesn't exist, you might create a new bill. Or you might want to take an existing bill and change what's there. And add something new that is missing, and think about, again, make sure that that bill doesn't already exist. What do you want to accomplish? Again, as specific as you can. Possible outcomes of the policy, as well as advantages and disadvantages. And this is comes down to really specific stakeholders, how it's going to impact the public, how it will impact your colleagues in the university, again, if that's what you're going for, or sort of different players in society, even the players in the hub that I showed you. And then implementation monitoring. So again, so you have an idea, you want to create a new program, how it will be monitored, enforced and managed, how much time and effort it will take, and again, what is the long-term impact on stakeholders? So a lot of this at the end of the day comes down to money. Can we afford this new program? Why is it necessary? Who is going to run it? How much money is going to cost and all that? So becomes really practical at the end of the day. And again, making sure that it's something new that doesn't already exist, and trying to sort of convince the right people that your idea is worthwhile funding, for example. So after all this theory, I want to give you a few examples of what it means to make an impact, because you think about what kinds of things could I be doing? How will my idea really change anything? How can I make an impact? As I said at the beginning, as an early career scientist, you want to address a specific issue. And so a few examples here from my own work that I think are impactful. So my interests as a career-wise obviously relate to early career researchers in science policy, and really their future in science, and the future of the STEM pipeline, which obviously has been really impacted by the pandemic. So a few things I worked on, and again, all of these are different kinds of impact. So one is organizing this panel, again, looking at impacts of the pandemic and early career researchers, which are grad students and postdocs. So we had a panel with them last year, and they participated and talked about how their research was impacted by the pandemic, with health staff, again, who work for legislators who have a way to impact this. And the idea is that they tell their stories. Health staff will then hear and go back to their boss and say, okay, we need to create legislation on this because early career researchers need more support or more funding or more programs or whatever it is. So these kinds of events are very impactful in terms of connecting with policymakers, inviting them to participate, and then hopefully you'll see an impact that comes down the road after this event. In this particular case, stories of students and postdocs resonated well with health staff and why they should think about funding more research, supporting the pipeline, and they actually have consequently done a number of things on this. There's now, or I guess a year ago, there was a legislation supporting early career researchers. There was a lot of language here and there about supporting grad students and postdocs and more funding and all that sort of thing. Another thing I contributed to was this RFI, so request for information. This is the sort of thing you see from the government. The National Science Foundation was looking for responses to improve their strategic plan and looking for input from the community. So this is another way to make an impact, is to send in your ideas for them to consider in their future projects. So in higher education, there's a lot of community advocacy. The American Association of American Universities, I guess this was also 2020, they gathered input from the community and sent a joint letter to the Hill. And so we contributed to this, the section that you see here around racial equity and diversifying the STEM workforce. So I wrote this section, which was sent to the National Science Foundation as part of a larger group letter. Again, this brings back the point that this is, again, a communal ask. This was one of probably 10 different sections that came about from a number of universities and other nonprofits and other groups, which put together this draft, which we sent to the NSF. So that's another good way to kind of do this sort of consensus building and sending a communal ask or opinion to a funding agency in terms of what they should do. And of course, this is about supporting the workforce. And then another way, and I alluded to this before, the legislation, which is a whole sort of thing on its own to learn how to write legislation. But in 2021, there was this legislation around the National Science Foundation for the Future Act, Department of Energy Science of the Future Act, so that's two different bills. Here, essentially, they were looking, or you could submit amendments, which is basically changes to the legislation that was circulating. And this was offered by Zoe Lofgren, who's one of the representatives from California. Again, they work a lot with the University of California. And she's very interested in sort of the pipeline question. So we wrote this amendment for the bill saying that essentially there should be included some professional development funding for postdocs, which was included. So they read the section, representatives vote, and then it gets included into the bill if they agree. The bill has advanced, I believe, past the House at this point, and it's we're almost a year later. Still waiting for it to go farther, but so that's one sort of tidbit. It can be very slow, but this is another example of success or impact, that if you're writing something that you really care about and it gets included in the bill, that's an example of impact here. So just the fact that I wrote the section, it's part of the bill is moving in Congress, that's another good way to make an impact. And you can read this article on Zoe Lofgren's website. So the legislation, again, is a powerful way, because at the end of the day, if this law goes all the way and passes, it becomes a law. It directs NSF to create a program to support postdocs, and that will be a law. So very exciting. Okay, so now I'm going to just shift to talk to you about the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. Slightly different, or sort of shift from what I talked about, but the reason is because writing policy is really critical to day-to-day. And again, all the things I talked about, being able to write a good letter, a good position, a good statement, or something that health staff will read. You've been organizing a good event and writing that in a way that will make them want to attend. Writing is critical to policy in all the different aspects that I talked about today. So I want to encourage you to engage with the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, because it's an early career journal for you all to look at and learn from and publish in. But I'll tell you a little bit about what we do and how we're sort of unique. So you may have seen the journal online, but we are international, open access, and peer-reviewed. We are also a nonprofit, and we really actually are more than just a journal. We provide independent platforms for the next generation to publish. We want to elevate young voices in science policy and their publications. Our mission beyond publication is also to help students and early career scholars bolster their research and writing credentials in science policy. So we organize a number of events, I'll show you. And we really also try to encourage trainees to contribute to the policymaking process at all levels of government, including local, state, and national, as well as international. And try to contribute to the professional growth of the authors and help them write to a diverse set of audiences, whether it's public or policymakers. We publish a variety of formats, as you can see here, so op-eds, technology assessments, policy memos, analyses, and others. We also promote the work through a number of means. Social media, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We also have a YouTube channel. And we also try to promote through our newsletter and a number of events. We have webinars and writing workshops. We organize or submit panels to conferences and have a podcast also where we interview published authors. So here are all the areas that we publish on, which you can see here. It's quite broad on purpose to really help to publish anything and everything in policy that trainees might write about, and we also help you advance the publication, and again try to elevate it after publication as well. So we publish 2 to 4 standard issues, 2 standard issues and 2 to 4 special topics. The standard issues are open calls for submissions. Can be any article format on any topic. And special issues are sponsored by a partnering organization. Actually, both of them can be sponsored, but they're focused in topic or scope. And as I said, eligibility given early career is one of these criteria, being either a current student, postdoc, or policy fellow within 5 years, or an early career professional under 30. And that's flexible on that, but there is a limit to where we again want to really make sure that we stay focused on the early career side of things. So a few upcoming opportunities. So currently these are the calls for papers that we have open. The first is a special issue with the Lancet and Financial Times Commission on Governing Health Futures 2030, Growing Up in a Digital World. So that's a long title. It's called GH Futures 2030. It's focused on strengthening youth-centered policy and governance of digital transformations in health. The deadline is August 21st. All of these actually will have some events around, but this is a big global topic in terms of health policy. The second one is co-sponsored by UNESCO and the UN Major Group for Children and Youth, and is around open science policies as an accelerator for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, a large global conversation around open science. UNESCO wrote the first sort of definition of this and the different elements that go into it that was adopted globally. And again, we'll have some events on this as well. And then the last one is a standard issue sponsored by the AAAS fellowships program. And all of these issues have a number of events, writing workshop, and a number of webinars. Again, the writing workshops really help meant to kind of provide practical experience, to hear from speakers and practice writing. And then webinars are really topical discussions about these areas with experts in the field that can help, again, give ideas about what you might write on and publish on, and really hear from the latest in the field. All of them are free and open and virtual, so you can feel free to sign up on our website. So I mentioned, in addition to articles, we provide opportunities for professional development. As I said, again, prior to each issue deadline, we hold webinars and writing workshops to help you prepare your submissions and improve your writing. These are all recordings to prior trainings. They're all on our YouTube channel as well. A few specific opportunities. So for the past 2 years, we've partnered with the GPS STEM program at UC Irvine on a certificate program, which is, again, free and virtual. There is an application process, but it's been very helpful to trainees around the world to apply and join. We plan to open applications in a couple of months, and this is a good program. We give you a certificate at the end. We have a lot of different activities related to speaking about policy, writing, engaging with professionals, and so on. And again, it's virtual. Next month, we will open applications for the second cohort of associate editors. Actually, no, in July, sorry. This is essentially, associate editors are helping with reviewing and editing papers that are submitted to the journal, have an input into sort of what's being accepted. And again, this is early career, an opportunity for you to read about what's submitted, provide your input, and contribute to the future of the journal, and learn how to write and edit in the process. So again, it's free. Again, we have an application, but it's been a very good professional development opportunity. And then we currently have applications open until May 1st for a pilot internship program. So it's a much shorter application deadline for students interested in science policy, kind of around published issues, since we have the editorial board for the issues. This is sort of all the other things, communication, outreach. We have the podcast and data analysis. So a lot of things that really help kind of drive JSPG forward as a business, which is, again, different from the actual editing part. But again, a good opportunity to engage in policy, work with our team. So we look forward to your applications for this. And so in addition to the items I already mentioned, again, I mentioned that we try to elevate the publications and make it somewhat actionable. So again, here are a few examples of that. So we, again, try to organize panels and events for authors to present their papers. This left image here, some of the authors presented to the UK Science Innovation Network. One of our issues is sponsored by them. They presented virtually to the British Embassy on their papers. And that was very exciting. So hopefully we'll have more of these opportunities. We submit a number of panels to conferences, so I didn't show you that here, but again, if there's a virtual conference that we can help authors present, that's something we try to do as well. I mentioned we have the podcast, so here in the middle you can see an example on environmental policies. For example, this is one of the papers that was published, or we had an episode. The podcast is really for published authors to talk about their papers and sort of societal relevance. We're looking to expand into different platforms. Right now we're on YouTube and SoundCloud, so we have a video and audio version. This has been successful also for trainees to present, and is an incentive to publish, because then they get to talk about their papers through JSPG, and that gets disseminated on social media and so on. So it's a nice little perk to publish and then disseminate your work and talk about it. We try to also make this more actionable. This kind of goes back to the impact question. How do we get published ideas out of the website into the real world? So last year we submitted this response to OSCP. They had this challenge called The Time Is Now, Ideation Challenge. So it was a sort of looking at diversity in science policy. We organized an event around published papers on the topic. Authors participated, so you can see the 3 panelists. We used published ideas as a starting point, and then submitted a response to the OSCP based on that. And so they're very happy. This is, again, a way to get the early career voices into something that the White House is looking for input, and now our ideas are there. So hopefully they'll use that. But that's a good way to kind of get the papers into the real world, so to speak, or do something actionable with the ideas published. And finally, we work to engage the media with published work. This is a work in progress. A lot of this happens through universities that highlight, for example, if there are students published in JSPG. Here's a highlight from Northwestern. Some of our published authors, again, this is from August 2021. They wrote about how we should publish in more languages than English. Northwestern wrote this nice article. And of course, it's nice for JSPG also that we were highlighted by the university. So this is one of the things we're trying to do, is, again, to do a little more media engagement, highlighting the publications in other ways and writing little blurbs about them, or having partners or other groups do that for us. So another incentive, and this is, we're trying to do more of this, but again, really trying to show how great the ideas are that are published, and get others to highlight the work as well. So in the end, to conclude, I'm gonna just leave this, and I'm happy to share the links again to the website, all of our channels. We have LinkedIn and YouTube. Again, you can subscribe to that for all of our trainings and future events, or to view past events on there. The newsletter, again, I would recommend for all of our future opportunities to publish and be in the participate in these events and other opportunities. And then this last link, Cycle Journal Careers, has editorial applications and the internship applications. Again, something to apply to, and hopefully we'll see your applications here. And then finally, I'll leave my contact, my LinkedIn, happy to connect with you, my Twitter, feel free to follow me there. And then my website also is just Adriana Bankston. And again, happy to connect with you and talk more. You can email me if you'd like to talk more about policy. And thank you again for your attention today. All right, how's that?
It was cool. Thank you very much.
You liked it? Good, good.
Yeah. I missed a bit at the beginning, but I stick into the end after that.
Good, good. Well, hopefully this is helpful to the students, and I can share the slides also if you want, and some of the links.
Yeah, the links would be really helpful. And the slides, I think for now, you can keep it by yourself, and I will ask if we can share it, because the main intention is to be attracted to the presentation and to your exposition too.
Got it. Yeah. Okay, great.
Let me stop the